Good evening, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to the annual Vogel lecture. I am delighted to see so many people here. We are very excited about tonight's talk. However, before I introduce our speaker and begin the official Vogel lecture, I want to actually ask the president of Ohio Wesleyan, Rock Jones, to come to the stage because he is going to make a special presentation tonight.
Thank you, Ellen, and thank all of you for being here. Each year we look forward to the Vogel lecture, partly because we have the opportunity to welcome Ezra back to Delaware and back to the Ohio Wesleyan campus, partly because we have the opportunity to hear a speaker share with us an interesting thought about our history, and partly because it brings to campus such a wonderful collection of people from Delaware, and particularly people whose roots in Delaware are very deep. And so I want to extend a special welcome this evening to those of you from the community who join us this evening and each year for the Vogel lecture. We're also very honored to have the Consul General of Japan in Detroit, serving in Detroit, Dr. Katayama, who is with us, a former student of Dr. Vogel at Harvard. Dr. Katayama, would you please stand so that we can recognize you? And we're honored to have a number of members of Ezra's family with us this evening. If you all could stand, please. Ezra's wife, children, grandchildren. If we would link them with Ezra's parents, think of the lineage from Delaware that is present here in the Vogel family this evening. We've had the opportunity on multiple occasions here on this campus through the years to pay tribute to Ezra Vogel for the remarkable accomplishments of his professional life. As you all know, he is recognized around the world and has been for more than half a century as one of the world's preeminent scholars of East Asia, working early in his career on matters related to Japan and more recently on matters related to China. His recent biography of Deng Xiaoping, that great transformational leader in China, will stand the test of time as the definitive biography of Deng Xiaoping, but that's one of only many of the seminal works that Dr. Vogel has produced. And it's been our honor through the years from time to time to recognize and honor him for his scholarship. But tonight, we recognize him for his generosity, and in particular for the impact of his philanthropy here at Ohio Wesleyan. Ezra's first gift to Ohio Wesleyan, or his first major gift to Ohio Wesleyan, was the gift that established this lecture series back in 1985. He sought to make a gift to the university in honor of his parents, Joe and Edith Vogel, who lived their lives in this community, each having come from Europe, Joe from Poland, Edith from Romania, is that right? From Romania, coming from Europe and then making their home here, where they operated the People's Store on Winter Street, a well-respected establishment that made an important contribution to this community for nearly 50 years. Ezra's parents, the Vogels, were generous benefactors themselves of Ohio Wesleyan. In fact, I want to read to you a letter written in 1958 from Herman Ships, who was in the Development and Alumni Office, written to Ezra's parents thanking them for a gift to Ohio Wesleyan. And in the context of that letter, Herman Ships said to the Vogels, "I am sure that Ezra got a great deal from his experience at Ohio Wesleyan and that the college is better off for his having been here. And here's the understatement of the year. He will make us all proud of him, I am sure." And hasn't Ezra brought pride to the city of Delaware and to Ohio Wesleyan? In 1985, when this lecture series was inaugurated, the inaugural speaker was Richard Smith, who is with us this evening. I saw Dr. Smith at dinner, and where is he? He had to leave. Well, he was with us at dinner, and he was the inaugural speaker in this lecture. But I happened to look at the article published in the Delaware Gazette the following day, and I read that Wayne Hilborn, and Jack is with us this evening. Jack, these are the words of your father. Wayne Hilborn gave a history of Joe Vogel, an immigrant who came to the U.S. at the age of 17 from Poland. He too mentioned several examples of Vogel's friendliness, love of people, and willingness to help the community. Edith was also an immigrant, having been born in Romania. Hilborn, a sports enthusiast, the acorn did not fall far from the tree. Hilborn, a sports enthusiast, said you could, quote, always depend on Joe to sponsor a softball team, end quote. And I think that that's actually a reference to the many ways in which Ezra's parents made an impact on this community through their generosity to various organizations, through their support, through the People's Store of people in this community. And again, the acorn did not fall far from the tree. Ezra has been a generous benefactor of Ohio Wesleyan for many, many years. But most recently, he signed over to Ohio Wesleyan the rights to the proceeds from the publication of the Chinese translation of his biography of Deng Xiaoping. And that gift has yielded more than $1 million for an endowment here at Ohio Wesleyan that will support the opportunity for students and faculty to study and travel abroad, with a particular emphasis on support for students and faculty who study in East Asia, where Ezra has spent so much time and has made such a mark. Ohio Wesleyan. Many years ago, Ohio Wesleyan established the Founders Circle, which recognizes those individuals and families and foundations that have contributed more than $1 million to Ohio Wesleyan. In front of the old Slocum Library, there is a semicircular brick structure with plaques designating the names of those who have achieved membership in the Founders Circle. And actually, about a year and a half ago, Ezra was inducted in absentia to the Founders Circle. But as he is here this evening, we are deeply honored to have the opportunity to formally present him as a member of the Founders Circle and to acknowledge him and thank him for his generous philanthropy to Ohio Wesleyan. Ezra, would you please come forward to be recognized?
It's such a great pleasure to come back here year after year. Not only do I have roots here, but I love the people I grew up with, and I love the community, and I love the university. And it's nice to see the excellent leadership that Rock Jones has given the university. And it's nice to see the spirit that I knew as a kid, and that so many in the audience who are my friends from childhood and have carried on this spirit. It's really a privilege to come back here, and thank you for letting me join you.
And finally on the table is a replica of the plaque that sits on the Founders Wall in front of the Slocum Library. Ezra Vogel, 1950, and those who are inducted into the Founders Circle are invited to submit something to be stated on the plaque, and Ezra simply says, to promote deeper understanding of East Asia. And of course, that is the life work to which he has been devoted now for more than 60 years. Ezra, thank you.
Thank you, Rock. And the History Department would also like to extend its deep gratitude to Ezra Vogel for his continued support of not only Ohio and Delaware, Ohio's history, but to the support of bridging ties across the university and the community. And that's one of the things that we find most valuable about this local history lecture every year. And one of the reasons that I'm delighted to be able to introduce this year's Vogel speaker, not only because of his meaningful and substantive work to Ohio history, but because of the opportunity that it gives us to bridge the annual Vogel lecture with this year's National Colloquium, also a great way for the community of Delaware to intersect with the academic life of the university. The National Colloquium this year was on water, which allowed me the great pleasure of inviting this evening's speaker, David Stradling from the University of Cincinnati, to join us as the Vogel speaker. David is a professor of history at University of Cincinnati, and he teaches urban history and environmental history. He earned his PhD at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, which is one of the leading centers of American environmental history in the country. His research interests include not only river history, which we'll be hearing, river and urban history, which we'll be hearing a bit about tonight, but also the history of the struggle across America, and in particular City for Smokestacks. City for Smokestacks. Oh, all of them. Excellent. The struggles across America, I'm so sorry, the struggles across America in urban communities to combat air pollution and to struggle with air quality concerns. His book, Smokestacks and Progressives, Environmentalists, Engineers, and Air Quality in America, from 1881 to 1951, grew out of this interest. And he has subsequently written two books on the environmental history of New York, city and state. And since moving to Ohio to begin teaching at the University of Cincinnati, has written the book that he'll be speaking about tonight, Where the River Burned, Carl Stokes and the Struggle to Save Cleveland, and has also invested a lot of his time and energies to producing resources for the classroom, to making pivotal environmental texts available for both researchers and students. Now, I first met David when he was in Munich at a conference on rivers and cities, and it just so happened that our paths intersected because I was also there on a research fellowship. And I was so excited by his work combining the interests of geographers and urban historians and environmental historians and local historians that I couldn't wait to find an excuse to bring him to campus to share the story of the Cuyahoga and Cleveland struggles with not only environmental and urban management, but with, as with so many Great Lakes cities, the struggles of identity and figuring out what it means to be an Ohio city in the transforming world of industrial America. And so I am delighted to be able to welcome David Stradling to present on his research on the history of Cleveland. So thank you.
Thank you, Ellen. I'm really happy to be here. Humbled to come up to the stage after Dr. Vogel. So humbled that I've decided to sign over the Chinese rights to Where the River Burned. And Dr. Vogel, you'll help me get Chinese rights, I assume. So thanks to Dr. Vogel, to everybody in the Department of History, and especially to Ellen, whose imperial sense of local history for Delaware County allows me to come here to speak about Cleveland. And in fact, to speak, I'll speak about the river, of course, and the fire. But mostly I want to read to you some sections from the book that pertain to Lake Erie, which I think tell us an awful lot about how it is that those who are trying so earnestly to solve the problems of urban America failed in the late 1960s and early 1970s in the particular case of Cleveland. But let me begin by telling you a little bit about how I came to this project. I wrote it, as you can see, with my brother, Richard Stradling, who's a journalist. He is an editor now at the News and Observer down in Raleigh. And before he took that position, he got a master's in journalism from Ohio State University. He and I both grew up in Cincinnati, and he likes Ohio a lot, and wanted to come up here on purpose. Ohio State has a very good journalism school, and he discovered this story about the Cuyahoga River catching on fire, and realized that there hadn't been enough work done on it. So he did this wonderful master's thesis on the press coverage, the changing press coverage of what turns out to be many, many fires on the Cuyahoga River. And so, first of all, I was struck by how good the work was that he did, because, well, he's my brother. And who knew that he could write like that? And second of all, because this was truly a story that could reveal so much about the changing relationship between cities and their environment, the fact that for a century the river caught fire periodically, mostly in the 1940s and 1950s, but as early as the late 1800s. And for the most of those fires, Clevelanders paid very little attention, except for the way in which the fires threatened the economy of the city. As you probably know, Standard Oil had its first major refinery along the Cuyahoga River, and there are other petroleum businesses along there. And of course, if the river catches fire, there's always the threat that the fire could spread and become incredibly dangerous. And one of them threatened to do just that. And so this is what the coverage really focused on. The river catching fire and causing some serious structural damage to an industrial city. That changes, of course, in 1969 with the last of the Cuyahoga fires, which is usually the one that people think of as the first and only Cuyahoga fire. There was a relationship there, of course, between our thinking that this must have been the only time that the Cuyahoga caught fire, because it's the one that we focus on. It's the one that theoretically is pictured on the beer that many of you enjoyed this evening. And it is the fire, of course, that Clevelanders speak of so regularly. So I'm going to say a little bit about, well, Michael Flam asked me to explain how it is that the river caught fire. So let me just pause and say this first. The fire that we pay attention to happened because, as you probably know, the Cuyahoga is a relatively small river, and it's slow, and it winds, and it passes underneath an incredible number of bridges, one of which is very low to the water because it marks the place where there is no river travel above it. And behind the piers, lots of debris could gather in this slow-moving water, and as the wood gathered behind these piers, it would raise up out of the water and dry. But it would be seasoned with petrochemicals that were in the water, which of course ride on the top. So this becomes a rather flammable material, and this bridge happens to carry trains that link the two major steel mills in the flats of the Cuyahoga. And as you might imagine, those trains can produce a number of sparks. Sometimes they even carry molten metal. Nobody knows how that particular fire started, but they do know that that's where it started, and it damaged the railroad trestle behind which that debris was elevated. I thought this would be a wonderful topic for me to explore as an urban and environmental historian. And I got started by investigating, as a good historian would, going to the archives and investigating the papers of Carl Stokes, who is the man you see in the middle of this photograph. He was the first African-American mayor of a major American city. He became mayor in late 1967 and understood his role in history. He's a very, very talented politician. Understood that his mayoralship would be pivotal in American history, saved everything. His collection at the Western Reserve Historical Society is astounding, the richness of it. I started my investigation of the fire by looking at a rather complete collection of letters that were written on the first Earth Day. So this is April of 1970, written to the mayor, most of them from suburban kids. I thought, what a treasure trove, right? There must be hundreds of letters about the Cuyahoga River catching fire in this collection. And I read, and I read, and I read. Almost none of them, really, hundreds of letters written by kids. Most of them in 8th grade, 9th grade, 11th grade, writing for various kinds of classes, biology, English, social studies, you name it. These kids, they write to the mayor as part of the Earth Day celebration, and they don't write about the Cuyahoga River catching fire. And I thought, whoa, well, that was a bust. This is just how much learning I had to do. This was just, 8 years ago. How much learning I had to do as a historian. It's not a bust. What it revealed to me is that the story of the Cuyahoga catching fire was not the story, right? There were so many other problems in Cleveland, even environmental problems, the problems that these kids wrote about. These were what preoccupied Cleveland in 1970. Just, let's see, it's just 18 months after just 11 months after the river had caught fire. It already was not the thing that they were talking about, which led me to believe that in fact, we were barking up the wrong tree, that I had to write a more complex story. Let me just explain this, this picture before I move on. This is Carl Stokes on what I call the pollution tour. This is the day after the fire, and this is in fact that railroad trestle that I was describing to you where the fire took place. You can see the railroad workers on the side of the photograph there. They're there to inspect the damage that was done. If you pan back from this photograph, you see that what had happened is that the fire was hot enough to bend the rails. It only lasted for about a half an hour. There are no photographs of the fire itself. If you think you've seen a photograph of the 1969 fire, you actually have not. You have probably seen a photograph of the 1952 fire, which was a much worse fire and did an awful lot of damage. You see also in this photograph a woman, I'm just going to mention her name. This is one of the very first, her name is Betty Cleric. She's one of the very first environmental beat writers. So she's there grilling Carl Stokes about the fire on the Cuyahoga, but also had been in conversation with him for a couple of years at this point about various environmental issues in Cleveland. I'm going to mention Betty Cleric in the section that I read. Okay. One of the reasons why the people of Cleveland, the kids of Cleveland particularly, did not write their letters on Earth Day about the Cuyahoga fire is that by far the worst environmental problem that threatened Cleveland was air pollution, which I'm not going to talk about today, but I did want to show you this photograph because it does two things for me. One, it is a reminder of just what it meant to live in an industrial city that was still making things before we developed the kinds of regulations that would prevent this kind of pollution. It's absolutely stunning. For those of us who have never lived in a city like this, to be reminded of what it was like. This photograph is taken by the EPA in 1973, so it's just a few years after the moment that I'm describing. The other thing that so the vast majority of the letters that were written to Stokes in 70 were about pollution. They fell into two camps. The larger is air pollution. The other is pollution of Lake Erie, which is what I'm going to talk about mostly today. Very few of the letters address the Cuyahoga River at all. And those that did, only about half of them mentioned the fire, right? So I had to, as a historian, I had to answer this question: why would they not address the fire? Why would so few of them deal with the Cuyahoga at all? And I think from this image you get a sense of why. These people had no connection to the river. It's very possible, and in fact if you've been to modern Cleveland, you know that it's very possible to to ignore the fact that there's a river there at all, right? You see the lake, but you can drive over the Cuyahoga River without even getting a sense that you're driving over a river. And so this is the Clark Avenue Bridge, which is still there, and you get a sense for how one might live in Cleveland and attach no meaning to the river whatsoever. Right? So I decided in investigating all of these archival research resources in the Stokes collection that I would have to really describe Cleveland from the perspective of Clevelanders. That meant addressing air pollution, which the book does at length. The title, of course, keeps us connected to the river fire, which does play a significant role in the book and also in Cleveland's conception of itself in the subsequent decades. There's no doubt about that. The Clevelanders still hark back. I would make the argument that that in fact the river fire is much more important in Cleveland now than it was when it happened, and in a year later when the Earth Day happened. This is part of that bigger picture. One of the reasons why suburbanites, these kids who are riding to Carl Stokes, didn't focus on the Cuyahoga River is because that they experienced air pollution and lake pollution as suburban kids. They had become disconnected from the city of Cleveland in significant ways. This is obviously a story in part about class, but mostly about race. Cleveland had, for lots of suburban kids, become foreign territory for them. They identified as Clevelanders, but did not experience the city in a complete way. Huff, the neighborhood of Huff on the east side of Cleveland, is deteriorating rapidly. There's a chapter in the book about the strife that runs through that neighborhood, which becomes the site of one of the major urban riots in Cleveland in 1966. And here you see a photograph of part of the aftermath when the National Guard have been called in at this point, too late, of course, for this building, which has been burned out. Carl Stokes is elected the next year, in part because even white Cleveland recognizes that something has to be done. He wins in a squeaker of election in a city that's absolutely dominated by Democrats, as you may know. He wins in a squeaker of an election against a Republican who doesn't even live in the city of Cleveland. So he convinces just enough whites to vote for him to become mayor. And part of the explanation for why those whites might vote for him is not just because they're loyal Democrats, but because they thought perhaps he would be an insurance policy, and people actually used that phrase against further racial violence in the city. Unfortunately, that didn't happen, and I mention this story here because it plays some role in what I'm about to read. The next year, in 1968, there is one of the most stunning moments of urban violence in American history in what's called the Glenville shootout, in which African-American nationalists get into a shootout with police officers and kill 3 of them, which plays a minor cameo role in what I'm about to read. So you put all of this together, the air pollution, the Cuyahoga River catching fire, problems with Lake Erie, racial tension, the fact that the city is deteriorating rapidly, stories about housing collapsing, jobs moving to the suburbs. All of this together, what we have is what Carl Stokes referred to as a crisis in the urban environment. And so what I wanted to do was make an argument about how these two crises that we think of as being separate, the urban crisis, which had mostly to do with concentrated poverty and racial strife, and the environmental crisis, which we think of as having to do with pollution and other kinds of environmental issues, that in fact these two things happen at the exact same time, and we have not, as historians, thought about them in the ways in which they actually overlap. Right? Carl Stokes did. He thought about them as one crisis, a crisis in the urban environment. And what he described was a city, Cleveland, that was going through a transition that we think of as a transition from an industrial city to a post-industrial city, or what I would call a service city. This was a transition that would require a great deal, and this is the argument of the book, a great deal of structural change, which is to say that we had to do something about all of these landscapes that had been degraded by the industry that had occupied them for decades. We had to do something about the lakefront, which had been occupied by industry, much of which was no longer there. Something to do with this unregulated or underregulated housing, which was in terribly poor shape. The entire urban environment had to be recreated, and Stokes begins that process. So part of what I'm doing is trying to explain why it is that Carl Stokes failed in that effort, but also explaining how much he actually got it, how much he understood that there was a structural problem, a physical problem that needed to be solved, not just in Cleveland, but around urban America, which he, as you may know, he was a very famous speaker, and he went around and described these things in great detail. So what I'd like to do is to read a few sections from chapter 4 of the book. The book is written in vignettes. And so I'm going to read a couple of vignettes. The chapter 4 is called Policy in the Polluted City. It's where I bounce back and forth between stories about air pollution and water pollution. And I'm just going to read a couple of the vignettes that, that focus on Lake Erie. And I would love to answer any questions that you might have about these particular stories, but also about the river fires and Carl Stokes himself. But first I want to read a little section that sets the scene. Oh, I meant to show you this when I was talking about the argument. This is Carl Stokes on that same pollution tour. And here he's standing with reporters, but the man over his left shoulder on the right of the screen is Ben Stefanski, who was in his cabinet, Director of Public Utilities, who plays an important role in what I'm about to read to you. They're standing at a CSO, a combined sewer overflow. So this is part of his pollution tour, describing some of the structural change that had to happen in Cleveland, right? Cleveland has combined sewers, and they simply couldn't handle all of the pollution that ran through them, and here he is describing that predicament. And I love this quote from Mabel Walker, who also got it, right? Understood that American cities, she's thinking mostly about the fluid city as being driven by automobiles and trucks, right? But we might think about the fluid city as also involving the rapidity with which capital could move around metropolitan areas and among metropolitan areas, right? There's an awful lot of flux in the 1950s and 1960s, almost all of which works to the detriment of central industrial cities like Cleveland, right? Mabel Walker understood this. She's advocating for just accepting this fluidity. And to some degree, Carl Stokes is accepting this as well, but he understands that he is not in a position to make the decisions that would help his own city. Okay, so I'm going to leave you with this photograph for a little while. If you don't know Cleveland, this is Lake Erie, of course. I'm going to be talking about what's in the foreground here, which is the East 55th Street Marina. This is a more modern photograph than the moment that I'm talking about, but many of the places that I'm describing are contained in this photograph. It's beautiful, isn't it? East 55th Street runs through some of Cleveland's most troubled neighborhoods. A 5-mile thoroughfare extending due north from the industrial south side, it stretches along Oathwaite Homes in Central, under the Pennsylvania Railroad Bridge and past the western end of Huff Avenue, before ducking under the New York Central's tracks and rising over the shoreway, just before ending at Lake Erie. Here on June 17th, 1969, this is just 5 days before the Cuyahoga caught fire, Mayor Stokes joined Governor Rhodes for the dedication of the recently completed East 55th Street Marina. After the Coast Guard ceremoniously raised an American flag over the new facility, Kylie Cronin, the city's director of port control, introduced a few local and state officials. The governor made a few remarks, and then Stokes stepped forward to speak. The greatest significance of this ceremony today is the recognition we are giving to cooperation between the state of Ohio and the city of Cleveland, he said, only hinting at the increasingly important but troubled relationship between the two. He continued, shifting to a happier theme. The state and the city have combined to bring into being this facility, which utilizes Lake Erie as the priceless recreational asset it can and must be, a source of delight, relaxation, and fun, recreation in the true sense of the word, not only for greater Clevelanders, but for visitors from the whole northern part of the state. Stokes was a careful speechmaker, writing out in advance even short talks like this one, certain to hit the right notes, certain to take advantage of an opportunity to deliver a message. Having pressed two important themes, state and local cooperation, and the need to take advantage of natural assets, the mayor went further, pressing another theme that had come to dominate his thinking. While we have the governor here in this refreshing breeze in our faces, I cannot help but mention the urban crisis and Cleveland's great need for help from Columbus. He spoke directly to the governor. When you get back to Columbus, we hope you remember that all kinds of problems remain here: housing, welfare, air and water pollution, education, law enforcement. The city would need help, state help, not just in the form of state tax dollars, but also through the creation and enforcement of better state laws, especially regarding pollution. The East 55th Street Marina was a particularly appropriate place to make this argument. Stokes said, somewhat awkwardly, that the city's problems were not, quote, docked right here, except for perhaps water pollution, but they exist right behind that skyline. This phrase, behind that skyline, was an odd choice, perhaps written the day before as he sat in City Hall, nearly surrounded by skyscrapers. But this morning, Stokes and the others were 3 miles from downtown, as you can see. And even Erie View Tower, which I write about in an earlier chapter, was quite small in the distance and partly obscured by the smokestacks of the municipal light power plant, which sat just to the west of the marina. You can see where the power plant is. It's the tallish building. It's the second building away from the marina. The smokestacks are gone here because it's no longer a power plant, but they were large 6 stacks at the time. And the largest structure near the dedication ceremony was the massive coal-fired lakeshore plant of the illuminating company, looming over the lake just a few hundred yards to the east. Perhaps Stokes was being as careful as ever when he said skyline, hoping that those gathered, including the governor, would take a moment to dwell on those 2 power plants, for their stacks took on considerable meaning in the polluted city, garnering outside attention in the struggle for clean air. And so here was Stokes, dedicating a new marina, praising the building of a new recreational city, looking out over a terribly polluted Lake Erie, while standing very nearly in the shadow of 2 notoriously smoky power plants, which themselves were inauspiciously nestled in a rapidly deteriorating industrial zone along the New York Central tracks and in close proximity to communities Central and Huff, that constituted much of the city's crisis ghetto, neighborhoods that had little use for slips to dock pricey sailboats and motor cruisers. The city planners who in 1949 had envisioned this facility or something like it, and planners who actually designed it in the 1960s, and Stokes who oversaw its completion, all understood that the 274-berth marina had been built for people who lived some distance from East 55th Street. With 270 parking spaces and easy access to the shoreway, which engineers were busy upgrading to meet federal standards for interstate highways, the new marina would be convenient to boaters from around the region. On this day, a mayor so attuned to the needs of ghetto residents left unasked the increasingly obvious question: who would be served by the new service city? 3 days before the dedication, Stokes received a letter of support from Willie L. Morrow, a former city resident who had moved to East Cleveland, one of the earliest suburbs to admit large numbers of African-American residents. He still worked downtown at the Central National Bank branch on Public Square, and he followed with great interest press coverage of the mayor. After quoting Martin Luther King on the issue of judging people by the content of their character and not on the color of their skin, Morrow encouraged Stokes to carry on. "Mr. Mayor, keep up the good works you are doing and don't let nobody turn you around. Keep on fighting for fair housing in Leesville area and everywhere. Keep on fighting for gun control laws. Keep on fighting for air pollution control. But most of all, keep on fighting for fair and better government for the citizens of all races of Cleveland and this great nation of ours. The range of issues Morrow referenced spoke to the breadth of the mayor's agenda, but they all came down to one: fair and better government. Morrow knew that better policy and better enforcement would be critical to solving Cleveland's problems. At the marina that morning, politicians gathered to celebrate a small step forward: government cooperation and the completion of a long-planned project. Still, many Clevelanders, even many nearby, could be forgiven if they saw little reason to celebrate. So I'm going to move into the first of the stories about the lake itself, now that I've set the scene. So each chapter works around public appearance that Stokes makes. So I bop back and forth between his moment there on the lake and other issues in this particular chapter. This section is called "The Fish Will Learn." A year before the marina ceremony, Mayor Stokes had taken part in another celebration at the lakefront, one that garnered more attention from the press. On the last day of July 1968, Stokes took off his shoes, rolled up his pants, and waded into Lake Erie, smiling and frolicking with neighborhood kids at the White City Beach on the far east side. Clearly in a playful mood, Stokes joined with the press for the first time since the Glenville riots began the week before. With his spirits up and his guard down, he saw a young woman in a bikini and commented to a plain dealer reporter, "That's what we mean by black is beautiful." Commanded by their mayor, nearly the entire cabinet attended this event, a celebration of the beach's opening. Director of Public Utilities Ben Stefanski, whose department had charge of water pollution control, stripped down to a bathing suit and joined the kids in the lake, and at least one cabinet member was thrown in wearing his clothes. In keeping with the upbeat and somewhat offbeat events, Stokes cut a ceremonial fishnet and directed a student band for a couple of numbers. After a terrible week, 7 people killed, 3 of them police officers, arson, National Guard patrols, and heightened racial tensions throughout the city, on this day, the sense of relief was palpable. The violence had ended, and the city could cool itself in the lake, swimming at White City for the first time in more than a decade. I'm going to show you this photo because it's a much more interesting thing to look at. This is actually not from the day of the White City celebration, but I'll come to this moment in a second. And I want to talk about this photograph too because I think it's terribly interesting. Months before, Stokes had sat with his cabinet brainstorming over how the mayor could keep his pledge and that Clevelanders would once again safely swim in Lake Erie. Fouled by untreated sewage, city beaches had remained closed summer after summer because bacteria counts exceeded recommended levels. Stefanski decided that instead of cleaning the entire lake, a long-term and incredibly expensive proposition, the city could instead cleanse just a small part, keep it clean, and invite the public to swim. He hired Havens and Emerson, a Cleveland and New York-based engineering firm, to design what became known as a swimming pool in the lake at White City, a municipally owned beach that retained the name of a long-ago failed amusement park, which itself had taken the name from the Chicago World's Columbian Exposition in 1893. Using a $325,000 grant from the Federal Water Pollution Control Administration, the city hired a contractor to clear the beach of debris and soiled sand, build a protective crib, and hang weighted vinyl curtains from pontoons floating out in the lake, separating the beach area from the rest of the lake. The city then doused the pool with chlorine to bring coliform levels down to the safe range. A week after the transformed beach officially opened, bacteria levels had dropped below the 1,000 count ceiling recommended for swimming, but just below. So Raymond Roth, the city employee overseeing the project, told the press, that is the Cleveland paper, the press, that 4,000 gallons of liquid chlorine would be poured into the pool, supplementing the 350 pounds of powdered chlorine that had been added by hand each day. The liquid chlorine was donated by Dow Chemical, which hoped the White City experiment would allow it to measure the effects of this type of application. Meanwhile, outside the heavy vinyl curtains, discharges from polluted streams, sewer overflows, and the easterly sewage treatment plant directly abutting the beach kept lake waters filthy and unsafe. Let's pause for a moment. They've put vinyl curtains in the lake. The water that's inside of that lake, they have added enough chlorine to kill all of the bacteria in it. Shocking. So this is another one of those moments where you have to, as a historian, you have to explain how it is that anybody thought this was a good idea. Lake Erie pollution had become a broad public concern in 1968. The Plain Dealer ran a weekly beach bacteria feature, a chart listing bacteria counts at the region's popular swimming spots. Headlands State Park, 20 miles northeast of the city, scored well below the threshold for safety. Huntington Beach, 12 miles to the west, was also safe. Bacteria counts along the city's shore were another story. Outside the pool at White City, the count could reach well above 5,000. In August, Edgewater Beach, just to the west of the Cuyahoga's mouth, scored an astounding 110,000. Despite the fact that the lake remained terribly polluted along Cleveland's shore, Stokes was pleased with the results of the pool in the lake experiment. The administration estimated that 1,000 people used the beach each day that's the summer of 1968, many more than would have defied the beach closed signs that had greeted visitors in previous years. Indeed, the pool in the lake worked well enough that the administration decided to repeat it the following year and even add an additional pool at Edgewater Park, where bacteria counts were astronomical. Stokes described the pool in the lake in his testimony before the House Appropriations Committee on June 5th, 1969. So again, this is the same month that the Cuyahoga caught fire. This is 3 weeks before the fire. As Congress debated spending millions of dollars to clean up the Great Lakes, he also relayed to Congress a list of Cleveland's accomplishments in the effort to control its contribution to Lake Erie's pollution, focusing on the passage of a $100 million clean water bond issue in 1968 and the passage of another $120 million state-level bond. Still, Stokes said that the lake's full recovery, a recovery that, quote, will permit complete utilization of water resources in our area for recreation, for commercial fishing, and for all forms of light and heavy manufacturing and processing industries, will cost in excess of $1 billion. Given this price tag, Stokes and his predecessor, Ralph Locher, recommended federal involvement in sewage treatment plant construction, modeled on the funding formula used to build interstate highways, in which the federal government paid 90% of construction costs. Utilization of water resources, Stokes argued, is as vital to our economy as a well-developed highway system. Knowing that the budget for Appropriations Committee was considering would not contain this much support, Stokes brought with him a small list of discrete demonstration projects, which might be funded and completed in short order. The list included creating diked areas for storage of materials dredged from shipping channels, materials that had traditionally been dumped in the lake where they continued to ooze pollutants. There was a scheme to combat pollution from sewer overflows by creating an impoundment area in the lake, about which more later, where untreated waste could be stored and gradually cleaned. The city might even attempt, quote, in-stream treatment techniques, such as adding chemicals to creeks and stream beds. Or perhaps the city could use federal dollars to install aerators in the lake in the hopes of reducing blue-green algal blooms by improving oxygen levels. All of these proposals shared a common trait with the swimming pool at White City Beach. They projected engineering solutions into the lake or streams, instead of creating solutions closer to the actual sources of pollution, the city sewers and industries that let their untreated effluent run into waterways. If this list represented a failure of vision, it wasn't Stokes. He knew how to solve the problem. Instead, the list of partial or temporary solutions represented a failure of funding. No one knew how the real solution would be paid for. At the congressional hearing, the mayor described the extraordinary swimming pool in the lake with pride, taking the time to praise the efforts of Stefanski, who sat next to him. Here he is again, standing next to him in the photograph. who sat next to him at the table. None of us like stopgaps or temporary measures when science and technology have provided us with potential solution for a problem, his prepared statement read. Let me tell you what we did last year in Cleveland to make a portion of Lake Erie available once again for bathing by children and families, as it was when I was a youth. Stokes then joked for a moment before moving on. That is a place where I have to apologize for because it is called White City. We're going to have to change that name, Mr. Chairman. It creates certain problems for me. In the coverage of the swimming pools opening the year before, race had not been an issue, but clearly Stokes had not forgotten the desegregation battles earlier in the decade when wade-ins forced communities to address discrimination at public beaches. Just the days after the last fires on the Glenville riots had been doused, here was Stokes wading in the lake on the city's far east side. Perhaps even more memorable, however, a month after he testified before Congress, Stokes actually went swimming in the pool in the lake at Edgewater Beach on the white west side. At a combined celebration of the pool's opening and the 4th of July, the mayor overcame his modesty and joined Stefanski and dozens of children in the lake. That was one small step toward the creation of a recreational city and a small step toward the creation of an integrated city, too. That's kind of a clumsy reference to the moon landing, which also happened at this moment. But let me just pause to look at this photograph. What do you notice about it? What's the most interesting? First of all, that's his daughter standing next to him, who seems to be a little bit less comfortable in the situation than Stokes is. Stokes, by the way, was just one of those fabulous politicians who was seemingly comfortable in any situation, at ease, even with his shirt off here, surrounded by children. You notice the hand reaching out to touch him? To touch his afro. This tells you something about the boundaries that were being crossed at that one moment, right? A white kid who had never touched a black man. And what does he want to touch? His afro. Right? It's a powerful kind of image about so much transgression that's going on here, right? That they're pouring chlorine into the lake to try and civilize this polluted place. And at the same time, Carl Stokes is transforming this beach by his mere presence. Right? Very meaningful moment for that child, I'm sure. Unfortunately, that Independence Day would be remembered not because Stokes ensured that the beach would welcome both black and white swimmers, or because the beach welcomed swimmers at all after a long polluted hiatus, but because a terrible storm rushed in from the northwest, catching thousands of people without shelter on the shore and hundreds of boaters unprotected out on the lake. The crowd at Edgewater, perhaps slow to give up prime seats for the evening's fireworks, dispersed too late to avoid debris thrown by gusting winds. 7 people died in the storm as the storm passed over Cleveland, most of them crushed by falling trees, including 2 of them who were running for the picnic shelter at Edgewater Park. The power went out in much of the city and much of the region, and downed trees blocked streets, impeding rescue efforts. The west side was completely devastated as far as trees were concerned, Stefanski remembered 2 years later, and his crews in the Public Utilities Department struggled with the cleanup, a long and arduous task. But Stefanski couldn't stop thinking about his pool in the lake at Edgewater Beach. When the storm hit, boats had streamed to shore as fast as they could, many of them running over the city's pontoons, sinking them. The vinyl curtain fell. The swimming pool in the lake had been breached. 2 weeks later, another smaller disaster struck the pool in the lake on the other end of town. When high winds and heavy chop continuously mixed the chlorinated and polluted waters over the pontoons and around the curtain wall, the city retaliated with more chlorine, which left beachgoers unhappy with the chemical smell. The plain dealer reported left fishermen even unhappier because the heavily chlorinated water had escaped the pool and caused a minor fish kill. Hundreds of perch, sheep's head, and carp floated on the surface. White City Beach fish perish in chlorine flood, read the headline above the weekly column written by outdoor editor Lou Gale. He described, quote, super bleached fish, and suggested that White City had taken on a new name, though not one that Stokes would approve, Chlorine Beach. After the July 4th storm and now these high winds, one might begin to think that the lake didn't want to be treated this way. Later that summer, far east side Cleveland resident Annette Coleman visited the repaired pool at Edgewater Beach with some friends. She was so put off by what she found that she typed up a letter of complaint to Mayor Stokes. "I am telling you," she wrote, "it was the worst beach I have ever went to. It was full of mud and a kind of mossy substance that was similar to quicksand." She also complained about the number of dead fish that had washed up on the shore. "The polluted water probably killed them," she concluded. The mayor's office directed the letter to Stefanski, asking him to respond, but it wound up at the desk of Edward Martin, who had arrived earlier in the year to direct the city's new Clean Water Task Force. Hired away from the Federal Water Pollution Control Administration, Martin was the city's highest paid employee. He was paid more than Carl Stokes, charged with solving one of the Cleveland's most pressing problems. As he mapped out a strategy for building new sewers and enlarging treatment plants, he took the time to respond to Coleman, and not with a form letter acknowledging the threats posed by water pollution and reassuring her with a list of the city's actions, the typical bureaucratic response to city complaints. Instead, he addressed her concerns one by one. "With respect to Edgewater Beach," he wrote, "we have taken steps to make water safe for swimming. The water is treated with chlorine to kill the coliform bacteria that makes the water unsafe. The chlorine also kills the fish, unfortunately, which is why dead fish occasionally wash up on the beach." With this explanation made, Martin then asserted, "Eventually the fish will learn to avoid this area." I'm glad you understand that that's stupid. I'm going to skip then to the next section about Lake Erie. As you might tell, the book pivots around two different months. One is the June of 1969, when the fire took place, and these events, including his speech at the marina, and the other is Earth Day in 1970. So it bounces back and forth chronologically and also reaches back. In June 1969, Havens and Emerson sent Ben Stefanski the Master Plan for Pollution Abatement, Cleveland, Ohio, an impressive 2-volume report that detailed the water pollution control system as it existed and recommended a series of upgrades to meet demands for improved water quality. The plan described shortcomings in the city's 3 treatment plants, some of which the city had already begun to address, and outlined steps that would be necessary to connect growing suburban areas to sewer systems, since most of the suburbs had not and would not build their own treatment facilities. But the largest problem facing the city stemmed from the 45,000 urban acres that were served by combined sewers, those that accepted both sanitary wastes and street runoffs. Cleveland, like many older cities, had constructed these sewers under the guidance of older engineering philosophy that prized the efficiency of running a single pipe through neighborhoods and tolerated the discharge of untreated sewage into waterways. Now, a substantial reduction of waste discharge into Lake Erie and its tributaries would require separating sanitary sewers, an incredibly expensive proposition. The process was already underway, since large urban renewal sites like Erie View included the construction of new separated sewers. The building of the region's highways also provided an opportunity to create new drainage systems. The vast majority of the suburban areas, including Shaker Heights, Cleveland Heights, and Lyndhurst, were served by separate sewers. But most of the city, including all 16,000 acres served by the easterly plant, was still drained by combined sewers. So that's the plant that's right next to White City Beach. Havens and Emerson assumed that the work of disentangling the sewers would continue, but it envisioned no immediate broad steps to enforce the solution. Instead, the firm picked up a plan that had been proposed by John Wirtz, superintendent of the easterly plant, 3 years earlier, about the time Havens and Emerson began to work on the master plan. Wirtz imagined the construction of a huge basin in the lake, formed by sheet metal walls protected by fill. As Wirtz described it, the basin would act as an expansive sewage treatment plant, collecting all the wastes runoff from the city's troubled streams and sewer overflows, along with the effluent from the easterly plant. Once in the basin, the wastes would receive treatment and solids would be allowed to settle out. Although Wirtz's idea was very expensive, costing as much as $75 million, it was featured in the Locher administration's grand plan. This is what you see here, Locher's grand plan for the lakefront, announced in June 1966. Locher's fantastic vision, with a total cost of $385 million, included a 7-mile highway running through the lake via a combination of causeway, tunnel, and artificial island. For part of its length, the highway would top the breakwater that protected Cleveland Harbor and pass along a new jet port built entirely out on landfill in the lake, beyond the harbor wall, and thus well beyond the existing airport built on landfill along the shore, which is the airport that's there now. On the other side of this new jet port, Locher's plan envisioned Wirtz's settling basin, where storm runoff and sewer overflow would be held in a 5,000-acre pond carved from the lake. As a bonus, the solids that settled in the basin could be pumped out and help form the landfill necessary to support the new jet port. All of this, Wirtz assured the plane dealer, would not smell. It would be the first stormwater basin built in a body of water anywhere in the world, he said. And I think we should pause again and recognize. Since none of the Locher lakefront plan came to fruition, it is easy to suggest that it had no hope of becoming reality. True, the highway on the lake must have been dreamt up by someone who had never spent a winter in Cleveland, where north winds regularly blow freezing mist off the lake chop. Perhaps the vision of ice-covered traffic jams a half-mile from shore, or the bills of the near constant salting that would have been necessary to keep the road passable, forced the city to rethink this aspect of the plan. Still, the settling basin and the jet port concepts remained alive, the latter into the 1970s, when an engineering study found that an island airport would survive lake currents. The settling basin, in an altered form, became the central feature of the master plan for pollution abatement. Right? So that crazy idea became Havens and Emerson's central idea for solving water pollution in Cleveland. In 1967, the Federal Water Pollution Control Administration hired Havens and Emerson to conduct a feasibility study of the stabilization retention basin in Lake Erie. That's what they called this thing. I'll let you look at this photograph for a while. The study concluded that the basin would provide a higher degree of pollution abatement than would a separation of sanitary and storm sewers at about 1/3 the cost. The report said no major objections or obstacles would prevent its construction have been found, although the firm only considered engineering objections, ignoring potential aesthetic and ecological concerns. The report described at length how polluted waters would pass through 3 areas of the basin. The first would provide aeration, the second a long still period for the settling of solids, which would form a sludge blanket at the bottom. And the third stage, just before the water was to be released into the lake, the city would add more aeration and chlorine if necessary. To minimize cost, pontoons holding neoprene fabric curtains would separate the 3 areas of the basin. Using its own feasibility study for justification, engineers really get a bad rap in my class. I selected these 2 sections mostly so I could harp on engineers and their myopia. Are there any engineers here? And their myopia. The master plan recommended that the basin, quote, be adopted as the ultimate method of pollution control for the area of east of Cleveland Harbor. The firm determined that a 900-acre basin in the lake with an average depth of 34 feet would be large enough to take all the effluent from the easterly and the other troubled east side sources. The master plan even touted secondary benefits of the basin, which would stretch southwest from the easterly plant toward the outlet of Dugway Brook in Bracknell. And if you know Bracknell, it's one of the wealthiest communities in the Cleveland metropolitan area. It's just mansion after mansion along the lake. As the feasibility study announced, the project would create a sheltered bay about 1.2 miles long, which would be an invaluable recreational asset, suitable for swimming, boating, fishing, and other water-based recreation. And here you see them imagining the recreational area. On the one side, you have the sewage treatment plant, and on the shore side, you have this wonderful recreational opportunity. This bay would be protected physically, and water quality could be readily controlled to bathing water standards, which means that they would add chlorine. Unlike the swimming pools in the lake, also designed by Havens and Emerson, the stabilization basin was no temporary stopgap measure. It was by far the most expensive project proposed in the master plan, roughly a third of the entire cost of the program. The basin shared important traits with the pool, however, even beyond the use of heavy plastic curtains strung from pontoons. Havens and Emerson had taken a rather narrow view of its task. Harmful bacteria and suspended solids would be removed from waters draining into the lake, but the lake itself seems to have won very little attention, at least not beyond the idea that it provided inexpensive space for a new sewage treatment facility. Following typical modernist thinking, Havens and Emerson had compartmentalized space, even space in the lake, just as planners had separated land uses in downtown Cleveland a decade earlier, which is the topic of an earlier chapter. In essence, the engineers treated the lake as a fully malleable space, not as a valued ecosystem where connections mattered most. For several years, activists had been demanding that the city save the lake without describing the path to salvation. With its stabilization basin, sludge blanket, and readily controlled bay, the master plan represented a half step toward a new kind of city, one that prized recreational spaces but held on to segregated thinking. Walls, even plastic ones, could not contain the fluid city, and they certainly couldn't contain the lake. So that's a reference back to Mabel Walker's discussion about fluid cities. Do I have one more moment, or should I? Okay. Yeah? I didn't actually pay attention to when I started. I'm going to skip to the end of the book and tell you how it turns out. You might know how it turns out. What's that? Huh? Well, no. See, there's no movement of time in the book, so it ends where it starts. But we get a sense for what the trouble is by this. In fact, this story predates the Cuyahoga River fire itself. I don't call it this in the book itself, but I'll call this little vignette Powerlessness. 2 years removed from office, Stokes published an honest assessment of his time in City Hall. Promises of Power, a political autobiography, was a frank exposition of the headwinds into which Stokes sailed as a progressive black politician as a city leader in an age of suburbia. Although largely tactful, as he tended to be, Stokes occasionally revealed his bitterness about the forces lined up against reform. The conservative ethnic bureaucrats inside City Hall who had held their jobs so long that their control was impenetrable. The conservative white leaders outside the city with their built-in hostility toward the central city, who saw little political advantage to aiding Cleveland. The white newspaper men who, quote, indulged themselves in a form of steady, slow assassination. And Ahmed Evans, the, quote, stupid, phony so-called revolutionary who decided to shoot it out with the police one night in Glenville. In Stokes's estimation, many of his dreams for real reform died along with those police officers that night. More than just political forces lined up against Stokes and the city of Cleveland. Suburban growth in population and resources had left the central city with its dwindling resources, its ever-diminishing tax base, its high concentration of the poor, the elderly, and the politically impotent, Stokes wrote. As mayor, this is Stokes again, you are in control of territorial boundaries, but you have nothing with which to sustain yourself. You cannot look to the people in the central city, for they have more needs than they have resources. Stokes had few allies, few options. You cannot look to the people in the suburbs because that is why they are out there, he wrote. You cannot look to the state because the legislature is controlled by a suburban rural coalition. Only the federal government could reach the suburbs, make them part of the health and transportation or air and water pollution control system, make them help support the city. Promises offered a thorough explanation for why his administration left only a modest record of accomplishment and why Stokes had decided not to seek a third term. Quote, in 1967, it still seemed that the cities could be turned around. 3 years later, the economic tide had turned, and we were headed for even more problems than before, he wrote. And of cities more generally, quote, our lack of resources, the high crime rate, the seemingly inexorable slide into decay and deterioration, the continued desertion of the cities by even the marginally affluent, the increasing unemployment and labor problems, all of these things were making cities virtually unmanageable. I could see that, for at least the time being, during a disastrous economic slump that was eroding our already pitiful tax base, the managers of cities could barely hold their ground. The book says little about the crisis in the urban environment, that is to say his political autobiography, that had consumed so much of his time and energy. The Cuyahoga fire warrants no mention. But Stokes did relay a story from June 1969 that conveys a great deal about Cleveland's predicament and long road to recovery. Stokes describes, quote, the damnedest period in his life, which began with the death of Donald Waite, the young white man stabbed by a black man down the hill from Stokes's home. Incensed, many of the neighborhood's white residents took to the streets. Stokes drove to the scene to beg for calm. After a tense confrontation with the dead man's father, Stokes climbed into his car and headed home up Woodland Avenue. There he found a darkened house encircled by police cars and officers carrying shotguns. They had been given word that the crowd of angry white residents was marching up the hill. An officer asked the mayor to join his family inside, keep the lights off, and get on the floor. His wife Shirley, 6 months pregnant, lay on the floor upstairs with their 2 frightened and confused children. Stokes sat downstairs in the dark, listening to the screech of walkie-talkies outside and the ruckus of the approaching crowd. A committee of my neighbors, Stokes called them, numbering as many as 200. The police used tear gas to halt the crowd. Quote, the yard is filled with police to protect me, Stokes wrote later, not from some foreign enemy, but from a mob of people who live 20 blocks away from me. That night, sitting besieged in his own house, Stokes had no illusions about the power he held as a black mayor of a white city. Here was a city badly in need of change, and the man who might force it through, both of them trapped and powerless. Thanks.
Thank you so much, David. We do have time for a few questions from the audience, and so I would like to let you add your voice and your questions to the discussion.
Well, I'm going to try to turn this into a question, but it's you know, you said that Carl Stokes lacked vision when he went before the Appropriations Committee in Congress to ask for to talk about the lake as opposed to what was really the problem, the source, the sewers. But was Congress going to give money to him for city sewers, or did he stand a chance to get money for Lake Erie? And you know, it's easy 45 years later to make fun of this idea of chlorinating a pool in Lake Erie. But frankly, I think the fact that they bleached the fish and people didn't eat them, they were going to eat toxic fish that they didn't know was toxic. And I swam in chlorine pools in the 60s. And chlorine was viewed as what you did to make it swimmable.
Sure, of course. The question is not the chlorine as far as people swimming is concerned. The question is this how you clean a lake, right? It's yeah. Well, I think you misheard me as far as his vision. Stokes had, I admire Stokes. I mean, his vision was marvelous, and he is there to ask for as much money as he can get. He does ask for all of the money that's necessary to rebuild sewers. He knows it's not forthcoming, right? So if there's a failure of vision, is what I said, it wasn't Stokes's. Yeah, right. As far as making fun of the You know, I think it's important to take a moment to recognize that that moment has changed, right? That we no longer think of this in an appropriate way. Nobody would propose to do this. That means that something significant has happened. And so largely, and this is not something that I cover here, what I would argue is that there is no ecological thinking that's going on in Havens and Emerson. They're simply unconcerned about the lake as an ecosystem. They're unconcerned about any place as an ecosystem. They are hired to treat the sewage. They came up with a plan that they thought could economically treat the sewage, and they may have been right. I consider that plan to be a total disaster, right? And it wasn't built because I think people came to recognize pretty quickly that it was a total disaster. Does that mean that they shouldn't have gone that route? Because they haven't solved their problem.
I share your myopia I share your position as an engineer.
Right.
My experience is more like concrete answer.
Right. Yeah, well, they were using neoprene, which I think is, maybe that suggests that they were on the cutting edge of engineering at the time. So in other words, I think you and I agree that Stokes had a good sense, I think, of the depths of the problems, the reality that he was facing. And the engineers are being hired to solve discrete problems that are completely, from their perspective, unconnected to all of these others. Yeah.
I think you covered this piece of Cleveland's history very well. I'm just curious what your observations are now, almost 50 years later, and where the city is headed.
You know, we, as urban historians, I think our conversation has shifted from trying to some degree, from trying to explain why it is that American cities collapsed at a moment when the United States itself was thriving, right? Cleveland is hemorrhaging population at the same time that the United States is growing rapidly. Its economy is in free fall at the same time that the United States is growing incredibly, right? These are some of the most prosperous decades that the United States has ever experienced. And they're terrible for Cleveland and lots of other industrial cities. To now trying to explain how it is that cities have turned around. What has changed? That so many cities have started to, at the very least, become more attractive places to live. The irony is, of course, that not every city is going to grow demographically. So I think of Cleveland right now as being a much more attractive place to live than it was in 1969. It's still considerably smaller than it was in 1969. And it's going to take a long time, if ever, for Cleveland to be as large as it was even when it was experiencing all of these hardships. That suggests to me that we can't use demographics as the only measure for urban success. And I think too often we use that shorthand problematically. Pittsburgh is probably even the best example of this, right? Of a city that has recovered, transformed, and now is a very pleasant city. I think it's a wonderful city. And it's much smaller than it used to be, and in fact is not growing. Does that suggest that it's not a successful place? I don't think so, right? My sense of Cleveland is that it probably is not done shrinking. There are a lot of neighborhoods that are, you know, as I'm writing in a period when the east side of Cleveland is really in trouble, that neighborhood after neighborhood is going through racial transition, which in the United States basically means that there's going to be a period of disinvestment, and the African-American ghetto is going to expand, and the building stock is going to deteriorate, and you're going to wind up with impoverished neighborhoods that sprawl across the east side. The same thing is happening on the west side now. It's really sad to see. So there are bright spots in Cleveland. I don't know if you have familiarity with it. It's not nearly as prosperous as Columbus or Cincinnati, but it's clearly in a better position than some smaller cities that had one industry. So.
We have time for perhaps one more question.
I was curious if there was a part of your research, or maybe a document that you ended up finding that really helped you define the narrative that you created? Because it's a very powerful narrative. I'm from Cleveland, so I really like the story. But I was just curious. I know that you had a lot of background with your brother's research and those documents that you were reading from the Earth Day letters. But I was curious.
That's a tough one, because I must say that one of the things that I really liked about Stokes is that I don't know how much of what I found that's under his name he actually wrote. I think it was a fair bit, and over time, just reading his thoughts over and over again, and you know how it is when you're a politician, you say the same things in different forms to different crowds. You emphasize different pieces. I can't pick out a single one, although I must say, if you're going to read anything from this period, it should be those Earth Day letters. And I use some of them in a documents reader. I think they're really fabulous. They're very insightful. Probably my favorite document is then not from Stokes, but from a little girl whose name was Stevens. I can't remember her first, Melissa Stevens, I think it was. She's, I think, a 7th grader. She went to school at a small Catholic school that's just on the west side. It's called It was called St. Wendellin's. It's not. The building is still there. It's a charter school now. It's not too far away from the West Side Market. Okay, you know where the Columbus Road. So it's kind of in this industrial neighborhood. It's not the nicer part of that close-in neighborhood, and the street that goes down from her school goes straight down to Truck Road, which is where there's a railroad track there, and there was a casual dump. And her letter is it's tear-jerking. It's about how there's this dump and there are rats, and she would really like Carl Stokes to come and clean it up, and if he did, that she and her classmates would take care of it. It's really, I mean, her attachment to this place is informative, right? And her paying attention to the broken glass and the rats was instructive to me about the difference between what it is to be a suburban kid, as I was, and complaining about Lake Erie, which might be 20 or 30 miles away, and which you experienced on an irregular basis when you wanted to go swimming or go boating or fishing, to experiencing the environmental crisis right there and then every day when you went to school, right? All that, the chaos of the inner city. So I think most of the letters that came to Stokes came from the suburbs, and they're also instructive and meaningful. But the class of kids from St. Wendellin's who wrote to Stokes, I thought was a powerful lesson.
Right. Thank you again so much, David, and thank you all for being here.
Thank you.